In 1997, a company was 90 days from running out of money. No dramatic explosion. No headline-grabbing collapse. Just a quiet countdown that almost nobody outside a handful of boardrooms even noticed. The stock had been battered for years. Analysts were writing its obituary. Employees were polishing their resumes. And the man who had once built this company from a garage had been pushed out the front door over a decade earlier. That company was Apple. Today, Apple is worth trillions of dollars. It sells more watches than the entire Swiss watch industry combined. It has convinced hundreds of millions of people to wait in line, for a phone. Its logo is recognized on every continent on Earth, and its products are so deeply woven into daily life that most people don't even think of them as products anymore. They think of them as just how life works. So how does a company go from 90 days of cash to becoming the most valuable business the world has ever seen? It wasn't luck. It wasn't just one great product. And it definitely wasn't inevitable. It was a strategy, quiet, deliberate, and in some ways almost invisible to the outside world. A strategy about control, obsession, and a very specific idea about what a company is actually supposed to sell. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly what that strategy was. But to understand where Apple was going, we first have to go back to where it started, in a suburban garage, with two young men who couldn't have been more different from each other. The year is 1976. Personal computers, as we understand them today, don't really exist. Computers are enormous, expensive machines that live in universities, banks, and government buildings. The idea that an ordinary person might own one, in their own home, sounds more like science fiction than a business plan. In Los Altos, California, a young engineer named Steve Wozniak is building computers for fun. Not for money. Not for fame. Just because he loves it. He's a member of a local group called the Homebrew Computer Club, where hobbyists trade ideas about circuit boards and machine code the way other people trade baseball cards. Wozniak designs a computer board, something he's genuinely proud of, and shows it to his friend, a sharp, restless 21-year-old named Steve Jobs. Jobs doesn't have Wozniak's engineering talent. What he has is something rarer, the instinct to look at a hobbyist's project and see a business. He convinces Wozniak that instead of just giving the design away to fellow enthusiasts, they should sell it. To fund their first batch of boards, Jobs sells his Volkswagen van. Wozniak sells his programmable calculator. It's not exactly a Wall Street-style funding round. It's two young men scraping together just enough money to believe in themselves. On April 1, 1976, Apple Computer is officially founded, with a third co-founder, Ronald Wayne, who sells his small stake back to Jobs and Wozniak for a few $100s within days, a decision that, in hindsight, ranks among the most expensive changes of heart in business history. That first product, the Apple I, is a bare circuit board. No case, no keyboard, no monitor included. You had to build the rest yourself. It sells in small numbers to hobbyists, but it proves something important. There's an appetite for personal computing beyond the world of engineers and institutions. Then comes the real turning point. To really understand Apple's DNA, you have to understand the strange chemistry between its two founders, because almost everything that made Apple different traces back to this partnership. Wozniak was the engineer's engineer, meticulous, humble, driven by the pure joy of making something elegant work. He didn't care about being famous. He cared about doing things right. Jobs was something else entirely. He wasn't the best engineer in the room, and he never pretended to be. What he had instead was taste, a sharp, sometimes brutal sense for what felt right and what felt wrong. He obsessed over details other executives wouldn't even notice, from the curve of a plastic case to the number of screws on the back of a machine. And Jobs had something even more valuable than taste. He understood that a computer wasn't just a tool. It was an object people would live with, look at, touch every day. If that was true, then a computer needed to be more than functional. It needed to be beautiful. This idea, design as strategy, not decoration, becomes the thread that runs through nearly every major decision Apple makes for the next 4 decades. In 1977, that philosophy produces the Apple II. Unlike the Apple I, this is a complete, ready-to-use computer, housed in a smooth plastic case, with color graphics that were remarkably advanced for the time. It becomes one of the first personal computers to succeed with mainstream consumers, not just hobbyists. The Apple II turns the company from a garage project into a real business, and by 1980, when Apple goes public, it creates more instant millionaires than almost any stock offering in American history up to that point. But success this early creates a dangerous illusion, the belief that the good times will simply continue. Every growing company eventually faces a moment where its early formula stops being enough. For Apple, that moment came fast. In 1983, Apple releases the Lisa, an ambitious, forward-thinking computer with a graphical interface and a mouse, technology that was genuinely ahead of its time. But it's also absurdly expensive for the average consumer, and it flops commercially. Then, in 1984, comes the Macintosh, introduced with one of the most famous television commercials ever made, a dramatic, dystopian ad that aired during the Super Bowl and positioned Apple as a rebellious alternative to a conformist tech establishment. The Macintosh brings the graphical interface to a wider audience and cements Apple's reputation as the company that does things differently. But behind the scenes, something is going wrong. Jobs, still in his 20s, is brilliant but difficult to work with, famous for demanding perfection in ways that sometimes tipped into cruelty toward the people around him. Tensions build between Jobs and the professional executives running the company, including CEO John Sculley, a man Jobs himself had recruited from Pepsi. In 1985, after a bitter internal power struggle, Steve Jobs is stripped of his responsibilities and effectively pushed out of the company he co-founded. It's one of the most stunning reversals in business history. The visionary who built Apple from nothing is now, essentially, unemployed, while the company that carries his fingerprints on every product continues on without him. For a while, Apple survives, even thrives, coasting on the strength of the Macintosh brand. But without Jobs' obsessive product instinct steering the ship, the company begins drifting. And that drift sets the stage for the darkest chapter in Apple's history. Through the late 1980s and into the 1990s, Apple starts making a series of decisions that, one by one, don't seem catastrophic, but together, nearly destroy the company. Instead of one clear product line, Apple releases dozens of confusing Macintosh variations, so similar that even employees struggle to explain the differences to customers. Prices stay high while a competitor, Microsoft, powering a growing wave of cheaper Windows computers made by many different manufacturers, undercuts Apple on price at nearly every turn. Apple's market share shrinks year after year. Its once innovative culture slows into something closer to bureaucracy. A revolving door of CEOs cycles through the top job, each one trying a different turnaround plan, none of them working. By 1996 and into 1997, the company is in genuine crisis. Analysts openly speculate that Apple might not survive as an independent company. Some suggest it should be broken up and sold off in pieces. Business magazines run headlines questioning whether the company even has a future. And this is where the 90 days from bankruptcy moment enters the story, a period when Apple's own executives, by later accounts, genuinely feared the company was running out of cash reserves and time. It's hard to overstate how dark this period was. This wasn't a struggling startup. This was a company that had once defined an entire industry, now teetering on the edge of extinction. Something drastic had to happen. And in one of the strangest twists in corporate history, the solution came from the very person the company had thrown out 12 years earlier. In 1996, Apple acquires a company called Next, the computer business Steve Jobs had started after leaving Apple. On paper, the deal is about technology. Apple needs a modern operating system, and Next has built exactly that. But the real prize walking through the door isn't just software. It's Jobs himself, brought back in initially as an advisor. Within months, it becomes clear that advisor isn't a strong enough title for what's actually happening. In 1997, Jobs becomes interim CEO of the company he co-founded and had been exiled for more than a decade before. He returns to a business that is bloated, unfocused, and hemorrhaging money. His first moves are ruthless. He slashes Apple's sprawling product lineup down to a tiny handful of computers. He kills side projects that don't align with a clear vision. He even strikes a deal with Apple's fiercest rival, Microsoft, which invests in Apple and agrees to keep developing software for its computers, a partnership that seemed almost unthinkable given the bitter rivalry between the two companies, but one that buys Apple crucial breathing room and a vote of confidence from the outside world. It's not glamorous work. It's triage, but it stabilizes the bleeding. And then, instead of simply managing decline, Jobs does something bolder. He bets the company's future on a single radically simple idea that Apple should stop trying to compete on every front and instead make a small number of products so good, so distinctive, that people would fall in love with them again. The first proof of that bet was about to arrive. In 1998, Apple releases the iMac, and it looks like nothing else on the market. Where other computers were beige boxes hidden under desks, the iMac is a single, curved, translucent unit in bold, candy-like colors. It doesn't try to hide the technology inside. It makes the technology itself feel approachable, even fun. It's also radically simplified. Apple strips away legacy ports and floppy disk drives that other manufacturers still clung to, betting instead on the emerging standard of USB and a genuinely simple out-of-the-box experience. Plug it in, and it works. Critics questioned whether consumers actually wanted a computer that looked like a piece of furniture rather than office equipment. The iMac answers that question emphatically. It becomes a massive commercial success and, more importantly, a symbolic one, proof that the old Apple, the company obsessed with design and simplicity, was back. But the iMac's true significance goes deeper than sales figures. It reestablishes the core belief that would define Apple's next 25 years. That design isn't decoration bolted onto a product at the end. Design is the product. How something feels to use is just as important as what it technically does. This philosophy is about to be tested on a much bigger stage, not in computers, but in an industry Apple had never touched before. By the early 2000s, portable music players already existed. So did digital music files. What didn't exist was a device that made moving your entire music collection into your pocket feel effortless. In 2001, Apple releases the iPod. At first glance, it seems like a strange move for a computer company. But Jobs had spotted something the rest of the industry hadn't fully grasped. Personal technology was shifting from something people used at a desk to something people carried everywhere. Music was the perfect entry point, deeply emotional, universally loved, and, at the time, badly served by clunky, complicated devices. The iPod's pitch was almost insultingly simple: 1,000 songs in your pocket. No manuals needed. A satisfying, tactile scroll wheel replaced fumbling through menus with tiny buttons. It wasn't the first MP3 player. It was simply, by a wide margin, the easiest and most pleasant one to actually use. Sales grow steadily, then explosively, as later generations become slimmer, cheaper, and more capable. The iPod turns into a genuine cultural phenomenon, white earbuds becoming an unmistakable visual signal, recognizable from across a subway car or a college quad. But the iPod's real importance to Apple's future isn't just the hardware. It's what came bundled alongside it, a piece of software that would quietly reshape Apple's entire business model. This is where Apple's strategy stops being about a single great product and starts becoming something much bigger: a system. Apple builds iTunes, a program that lets people organize their digital music library and sync it effortlessly with their iPod. Then, in 2003, Apple launches the iTunes Music Store, allowing people to legally buy individual songs for a small, simple price, at a moment when the music industry is being torn apart by piracy and lawsuits. This move does something subtle but incredibly powerful. It doesn't just sell songs. It locks the iPod, the software, and the online store together into a single, seamless experience. Buy a song on iTunes, and it lives right there on your iPod. Buy an iPod, and iTunes is the obvious place to fill it with music. This is the moment Apple's real long-term strategy starts to crystallize, one that would define the company far more than any individual gadget. Build hardware, software, and services that all work beautifully together and struggle badly with anything that doesn't come from Apple. It's a strategy sometimes described as a walled garden. Once you're inside, once your music, your habits, your devices are all tied together, leaving becomes inconvenient enough that most people simply don't. Not because they're trapped by force, but because everything just works, and the alternative means giving that up. This ecosystem thinking is, in many ways, the true secret strategy behind Apple's rise. Not any single invention, but the discipline to make every product reinforce every other product, turning customers into long-term participants in a system rather than one-time buyers of a gadget. And the device that would prove this strategy beyond any doubt was still to come. In January 2007, Steve Jobs walks onto a stage in San Francisco and tells the audience that Apple is about to reinvent the phone. It's a bold claim. Mobile phones already existed, of course, in huge numbers. Business-focused devices offered email and physical keyboards. But nothing on the market combined a phone, an internet browser, and a music player into one genuinely intuitive touchscreen device. The iPhone changes that. Instead of physical buttons, it uses a responsive, multi-touch glass screen. Instead of a stripped-down mobile browser, it renders full websites the way a computer would. It folds the iPod's music capabilities directly into the phone, effectively making a whole product category, the standalone MP3 player, obsolete within its own product line. The first iPhone isn't perfect. It's expensive and initially limited compared to what would come later. But it establishes a new baseline for what a smartphone should feel like, and competitors spend years trying to catch up to that standard. More than any other product, the iPhone becomes the engine of Apple's financial transformation, eventually accounting for the majority of the company's revenue for well over a decade. It also becomes the strongest possible expression of that ecosystem strategy, an object so central to daily life that it becomes the natural hub for everything else Apple sells. But the iPhone's true genius wasn't only the device sitting in your hand. It was what Apple did next to turn that device into an entire economy of its own. In 2008, Apple opens the App Store, allowing outside developers to build and sell software directly for the iPhone. This decision transforms the iPhone from a fixed product into an open-ended platform. Suddenly, the phone isn't just what Apple built, it's whatever hundreds of thousands of developers around the world can imagine, from games to productivity tools to entirely new categories of business that didn't exist before smartphones, like ride-sharing and food delivery apps. Apple takes a percentage of revenue from paid apps and in-app purchases sold through the store, a business arrangement that, over time, becomes an enormous and highly profitable revenue stream in its own right, separate from hardware sales entirely. This is a critical shift in how to think about Apple's business. It's no longer simply a device manufacturer. It's a platform owner, sitting at the center of a vast economy of developers, businesses, and consumers, collecting a toll on a huge share of digital commercial activity that flows through its devices. And because Apple controls both the hardware and the store where software gets distributed, it has a level of influence over its platform that few companies in history have ever held over an entire industry. This dominance didn't happen by accident. It required something most people never see when they unbox a shiny new iPhone, a manufacturing operation of almost unbelievable scale and precision. Behind every iPhone, iPad, and MacBook is one of the most sophisticated manufacturing and logistics operations on the planet, and this part of Apple's story rarely gets the attention it deserves, because it's not glamorous. It doesn't show up in a flashy keynote, but it might be just as important as any product Apple has ever designed. Much of the credit for this belongs to Tim Cook, who joined Apple in the late 1990s to overhaul its operations, long before he became CEO. Cook approached manufacturing and logistics with the same obsessive precision Jobs brought to design, negotiating hard with suppliers, minimizing inventory, and building relationships with manufacturing partners capable of producing devices at massive scale without sacrificing consistent quality. This operational excellence matters more than it might seem. A brilliant product design means very little if a company can't actually produce it in the tens of millions, on time, without massive cost overruns or supply shortages. Apple's ability to do exactly that, repeatedly, product cycle after product cycle, became a genuine competitive advantage that rivals struggled to match. When Tim Cook eventually succeeds Steve Jobs as CEO in 2011, this operational discipline becomes even more central to how Apple runs. Cook isn't the visionary product obsessive that Jobs was, and he's never pretended to be. Instead, he becomes the steward who scales what Jobs built, running the business side with remarkable consistency, while product leadership shifts to other executives within the company. But none of this operational muscle would matter if people didn't actually want to buy what Apple was making, and that desire was being carefully, deliberately engineered. Here's a question worth sitting with. Why are people consistently willing to pay significantly more for an Apple product than for a competitor with similar technical specifications? The answer isn't really about the specs at all. It's about psychology. Apple has spent decades cultivating an image built around a handful of consistent ideas: simplicity, quality, creativity, and a sense of good taste. Its retail stores, bright, open, minimalist spaces, deliberately placed in high-traffic, high-visibility locations, reinforce this feeling before a customer even picks up a product. Its packaging is engineered so that opening a box feels less like unwrapping a gadget and more like a small ceremony. None of this is accidental. Every touchpoint, from the first ad you see to the box the product arrives in, is designed to reinforce the same underlying message. This isn't just a device. It's a reflection of who you are. This is premium positioning at its most effective. Apple rarely competes on price, and it almost never needs to, because it has convinced a massive global customer base that price isn't really the point. The point is quality, identity, and belonging to something that feels a little more thoughtful than the alternatives. And that emotional connection didn't happen by accident either. It was built, deliberately, through some of the most disciplined marketing in modern business history. Apple's advertising rarely spends much time listing technical specifications. Instead, it sells a feeling, creativity, simplicity, belonging, even rebellion. Think back to that 1984 Macintosh commercial, positioning Apple as the underdog fighting against conformity. Or the Think Different campaign of the late 1990s, which barely showed Apple products at all, instead celebrating visionaries and misfits throughout history, quietly inviting the viewer to see themselves the same way, and to see Apple as the company built for people like them. This emotional branding creates something far more durable than a one-time sale: loyalty. Apple customers don't just buy a new iPhone because the old one broke. Many buy it because staying within the Apple ecosystem, where their photos, messages, and habits already live, feels natural, even comforting. That loyalty translates into something every business ultimately cares about: predictable, repeatable revenue, purchase after purchase, generation of device after generation of device. And when you combine that loyalty with the ecosystem strategy, the platform dominance of the App Store, and the operational excellence of the supply chain, you get a financial engine unlike almost anything else in corporate history. The numbers behind Apple's rise are almost difficult to comprehend in isolation. In August 2018, Apple becomes the first publicly traded American company to reach $1 trillion market valuation. Just over 2 years later, in 2020, it crosses $2 trillion. It later becomes the first company in history to reach $3 trillion in value. By 2026, Apple's market capitalization sits in the range of several trillion dollars, making it, alongside a small handful of technology giants, one of the most valuable companies the world has ever seen, with the ranking at the very top shifting periodically between Apple and a small number of other tech titans as markets move. What makes this growth especially remarkable is where it comes from. It's not built on a single hit product sustained by hope. It's built on a diversified, self-reinforcing system. Hardware sales, a massive and growing services business built on the App Store and subscriptions, and one of the most loyal customer bases in the history of consumer technology. Apple Services division alone, encompassing the App Store, subscriptions, and related offerings, has grown into a business so large that, on its own, it would rank among the world's most valuable companies. But no empire this large reaches this size without resistance. And Apple's story wouldn't be honest or interesting without confronting the criticism and competition that have shadowed it every step of the way. For all its success, Apple has never been without serious challengers and serious critics. Competitors like Samsung have built massive smartphone businesses of their own, often undercutting Apple on price while matching or exceeding it on certain technical specifications. In China, homegrown manufacturers have captured enormous market share by offering capable devices at a fraction of Apple's price point. Apple has also faced significant regulatory scrutiny around the world. Governments and regulators in the United States, the European Union, and elsewhere have investigated and, in some cases, penalized Apple over its App Store practices, particularly the commission it charges developers and the restrictions it places on alternative payment methods and app distribution. Critics argue that Apple's tightly controlled ecosystem, the very thing that made it so successful, has crossed the line into anti-competitive behavior that unfairly squeezes out smaller developers and rivals. There have been manufacturing controversies too, including scrutiny of labor conditions at some overseas supplier facilities, which drew public criticism and forced Apple to publicly commit to auditing and reform efforts across its supply chain. And there's an ongoing debate about innovation itself. Some critics argue that in recent years, Apple has shifted from being the industry's boldest innovator to something closer to a highly disciplined refiner, improving existing product categories incrementally rather than inventing entirely new ones the way it did with the iPod, iPhone, and iPad. These aren't small criticisms, and Apple hasn't been immune to any of them. But it's worth noting what these challenges reveal by contrast. A company this scrutinized, this competed against, and still this dominant, has clearly built something more durable than a single winning product cycle. So where does all of this leave Apple today? As of the mid-2020s, Apple remains one of the most valuable companies on Earth, with a market capitalization stretching into multiple trillions of dollars, competing for the very top of that ranking alongside a small handful of other technology giants. Its product lineup has expanded well beyond the iPhone that once defined it, including the Apple Watch, which has become one of the best-selling wearable devices in the world, AirPods, which turned wireless earbuds into a mainstream category almost single-handedly, and a growing services business spanning subscriptions for music, television, and cloud storage. Under Tim Cook's leadership, Apple has also begun investing heavily in areas like health technology, embedding health and fitness tracking directly into everyday devices millions of people already wear, and has been steadily building out its own custom chip technology, giving it tighter control over performance and efficiency across its entire product line than almost any competitor can match. The company continues to face real questions about where its next major growth chapter comes from, in a market where the smartphone itself, the product that built its modern empire, has matured and slowed in growth in many parts of the world. But whatever comes next, Apple approaches it from a position very few companies in history have ever occupied. Enormous cash reserves, a fiercely loyal customer base, and a business model built to reinforce itself year after year, product after product. Which brings us to the real question behind this entire story, not just what Apple did, but what any of us can actually learn from it. Strip away the size and the trillion-dollar numbers, and Apple's story offers a handful of lessons that apply just as much to a small business as to a global giant. First, design is not decoration. Design is strategy. From the very first Macintosh to the iPhone in your pocket, Apple treated how something looks and feels as seriously as what it technically does. That's a mindset available to any business, at any size, in any industry. Second, build systems, not just products. The real secret behind Apple's rise wasn't the iPod, or the iPhone, or the App Store in isolation. It was the discipline to make every product reinforce every other product, creating a system that becomes more valuable and harder to leave the more of it you use. Third, say no more often than you say yes. When Jobs returned in 1997, his first major move wasn't expansion, it was ruthless simplification, cutting Apple's product line down to a fraction of its former size. Focus, even when it feels like sacrifice, is often what makes greatness possible. Fourth, premium positioning requires total consistency. You cannot charge more than your competitors by accident. It requires disciplined consistency across every single touchpoint, the product, the packaging, the stores, the advertising, so that customers feel, without needing to be told, that what they're buying is worth the price. And finally, resilience matters more than any single success. Apple was 90 days from running out of money. It's easy to forget that now, looking at trillion-dollar valuations. But the company's greatest chapter only became possible because it survived its darkest one, and because the people steering it were willing to make painful, unpopular decisions to get there. So what was the secret strategy that made Apple the most valuable company in the world? It wasn't a single invention. It wasn't a marketing slogan, or a clever pricing trick, or even Steve Jobs' undeniable talent alone, as important as all of those things were along the way. The real secret was patience with a system. Apple built hardware, software, services, retail, and marketing to reinforce one another so completely that the whole became worth dramatically more than the sum of its parts. It made painful, focused choices when the easier path would have been to chase every opportunity at once. And it survived a near-death experience that would have ended most companies for good, then used that brush with failure as the discipline it needed to build something far stronger than what came before. Every industry has companies chasing the next hit product, the next viral moment, the next headline. Apple's story suggests something quieter, and maybe more useful, that the businesses built to last aren't necessarily the ones with the single best idea. They're the ones patient enough and disciplined enough to turn a handful of good ideas into a system nothing else can easily replace. That, in the end, may be the most valuable lesson a trillion-dollar company can teach anyone starting with nothing more than a garage, a good idea, and the will to see it through.
If you enjoyed this documentary and learned something new today, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications